Hey, what's up? Welcome back to your channel name. This time, we're going to dive into a story that will make you think twice before walking alone at night. Grab some snacks, turn off the lights, and listen closely. Edward Mallory never imagined that this journey would become the darkest chapter of his life. He wasn't someone easily swayed by the supernatural, even though his profession as a mythologist often led him to places labeled cursed by locals. He always dismissed such claims as folklore, tales passed down through generations, shaped more by fear than fact. But Kilnary was different. The village didn't appear on any tourist map. Even regular road maps barely acknowledged it. Hidden deep in Western Ireland, beyond the fog-thick Claddagh forest, Kilnary was only accessible by a narrow dirt path winding through overgrown hedgerows and fallen leaves. Moss-covered stone houses sat quietly amid the morning mist, like relics from a time that refused to pass. Edward rented an old stone cottage at the far end of the road, just before the edge of the forest. The building looked like it belonged in a war documentary. Wooden doors warped by age, windows that barely opened, and silence that pressed against the walls. He hadn't chosen the place for its comfort, but for its location. It sat disturbingly close to what the locals whispered about as Whistler Hollow, a term he had never encountered in any official records. Through clippings and fragmented books, he'd found mention of a creature that appeared before a person's death, never clearly seen, only marked by a long, melodic whistle that echoed across 3 consecutive nights. He assumed it was another variant of Irish death folklore, similar to the banshee but without a human form. On his first day, Edward spent time surveying the area and documenting the stonework. But something felt off. Not the cold air, which was expected, but the cold stares. Even the children stopped playing to stare at him with unreadable expressions. It was as if his arrival had awakened something the village had worked hard to forget. In the days that followed, Edward tried to integrate with the villagers. He visited the local tea shop run by an elderly woman, attempting to ask questions about the whistling legend. But whenever he mentioned the word whistle, smiles would fade, conversations would stall, and some would even walk away without a word. He realized the topic wasn't just taboo, it was feared. And his presence wasn't merely strange, it was unwelcome. Whispers followed him wherever he went. Phrases like curse chaser and death caller trickled from behind market stalls. Edward began to feel like he wasn't just studying a legend, he was stepping into it. Several times, he noticed a group of elderly men gathering around an old stone well at the village's center. Their hands clutched prayer beads, and their voices murmured in a language too old to recognize. When Edward approached, they scattered quickly. One of them paused only to glance toward Claddagh forest and cross his fingers over his chest, warding off something invisible. Despite all the fear, one name kept Sir. Finding Bridget's cottage wasn't difficult. It stood alone on the border of Claddagh forest, half swallowed by overgrown roots and tangled brambles. The roof sagged under the weight of vines, and the stone walls were covered in faded chalk symbols. Straw dolls hung from the fence posts like silent sentinels. Above the door hung a garland of withered black flowers. As Edward approached, the air grew thick and heavy. It wasn't just cold, it felt charged. His hand hesitated before knocking. Then the door creaked open on its own. Bridget stood in the threshold, as if expecting him. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her eyes milky and distant, like she was seeing through time. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the smell of damp earth. Shelves were lined with jars of strange roots, feathers, and liquids of various hues. The house felt like a blend of forest shrine and forgotten apothecary. Bridget said nothing at first. Instead, she handed Edward a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside were clippings, newspaper articles, faded sketches, and a hand-drawn image of a massive bird-like creature with hollow eyes and a long, flute-like beak. On the back of the sketch were the words, Whistler Hollow. Bridget offered no explanation. She simply raised a hand and pointed toward the forest. Her lips barely moved as she whispered something Edward would never forget: "Not all sounds in the night are meant to be heard." That night, darkness fell faster than expected. The fog thickened early, swallowing the trees and turning the sky to ash. Edward sat in his study, sorting through notes, a portable recorder running beside him to capture ambient sounds around the cottage. Around 2 a.m., it happened. A sound, not wind, not a bird, but something deliberate. A slow, haunting whistle that floated just above the tree line. Soft at first, then slightly louder, as if being played by something with lungs. Something watching. Edward stopped everything and opened the window. The cold struck his face, but nothing moved outside. Nothing but shadows and mist. Then he saw it, on the fence. A feather. Long, black, and unnaturally sharp at the end. Not from any bird he had ever encountered. He brought it inside. The texture was coarse, almost reptilian. Under his portable microscope, he noticed strange ridges, more like scales than barbs. His heart pounded. He'd studied avian biology for years. No known bird had this structure. Sleep became impossible. The whistle came again. Not loud, but closer. Marking it in his notes, he wrote, "First night." He remembered the old warnings: 3 nights of whistling, then it comes. The next morning, determined to investigate further, Edward searched the house. Deep in the cellar behind an old cabinet, he found a small wooden chest secured with a delicate lock. A key, one he'd noticed hanging above the kitchen door, fit perfectly. Inside were notebooks, old, yellowing with time. They belonged to the previous tenant, Patrick Callahan. His early entries were meticulous, scientific. Observations on the sounds he'd heard at night, theories on pressure shifts and bird migrations. But over time, the writing grew frantic. Notes turned into rants, then into desperate scrawlings. Patrick claimed to hear the whistle every night. He wrote of dreams that bled into waking hours, of shapes outside the window that moved against the wind. On the final page, one phrase stood alone, written with what looked like a brush soaked in ink, or perhaps something darker: "It comes after the 3rd whistle. Do not look into its eyes." The rest of the pages were blank. Edward closed the book slowly, spine creaking. The room was silent, but the cold had returned. Not just in the air, but in his chest. As if something ancient and invisible had been watching him read, and now knew he was ready. The second night began with heavy rain, but by midnight, the skies had cleared too quickly. The fog rolled in once again, this time denser, pushing up against the windows like a living thing. Edward sat awake, recorder on, ears alert. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for: evidence, maybe, or perhaps confirmation that the whistle had only been a trick of his tired mind. At 2:13 a.m., it returned. The same long, sorrowful note. But it wasn't coming from the forest this time. It was closer. Much closer. It seemed to echo around the cottage, as though the sound bent through the trees unnaturally. It didn't just exist in the air, it seemed to vibrate inside his bones. He grabbed his field recorder and stepped out into the mist. The fog swallowed him instantly. Trees twisted into alien shapes under the moonlight, their branches reaching like skeletal arms. The whistle came again, louder now, and with it, movement. Fast and low to the ground, something glided past him, brushing the tops of the grass. He turned, but saw nothing. Only the feather, another one, laying perfectly upright in the wet soil, unmoved by wind or breath. This time, Edward marked the timestamp with shaking hands. Second night. He whispered it to himself as he locked the doors behind him. No wind, no animals, no tricks of the ear. Whatever it was real. And it was approaching. At daybreak, driven by both fear and curiosity, Edward ventured toward the area the locals referred to as Whistler Hollow. It wasn't marked on any map, but based on old church records Bridget had slipped into the bundle, he found a reference to the glen of still voices, a patch of land once avoided during funeral processions. The path was rough and choked by brambles, but Edward pressed on. Eventually, he reached a clearing bordered by blackthorn trees. At its center lay a shallow depression in the earth, almost bowl-shaped, where no grass grew. At the hollow center stood a crooked stone monolith, wrapped in rusted wire and old bird bones tied with red string. The air felt wrong here. No birds. No wind. A silence so thick it hurt his ears. As he stepped closer to the monolith, a sudden wave of nausea hit him. His knees buckled. And then, the whistle, soft, almost sympathetic, flowed from somewhere beneath the stone. It wasn't a call. It was a warning. As he stumbled back, he noticed markings carved into the rock. Not Celtic, not Druidic, something older. Symbols that pulsed faintly, as if freshly etched. He left without documenting them, the instinct to flee overwhelming his scientific discipline. That night would be the third. As the third night fell, a dreadful calm settled over the cottage. Edward didn't sleep. He sat with every light on, every device recording, every window covered. He tried playing white noise, prayer chants, even recordings of bird calls. Nothing pierced the stillness. At 1:59 a.m., the whistle began. It came in intervals, longer this time. The melody was no longer a simple note, it rose and fell, like breath through a flute, or lungs gasping in rhythm. The sound circled the house, window to window, wall to wall, until it felt like the entire structure breathed with it. Edward froze, his hands trembling above the recorder. Then, as the whistle reached what felt like its crescendo, it stopped. Abruptly. No echo. No fade. Just silence. In that moment, the world felt suspended. Then came the knock, 3 sharp taps on the back window. Not scratching. Not wind. A knock. As if someone, or something, waited to be invited. He didn't approach. He didn't breathe. But his mind began to splinter with panic. The air in the room grew thick, and behind him, in the black of the hallway mirror, a shape formed, tall, curved, with long limbs and a head too narrow for a human skull. Edward turned. The hallway was empty. But the mirror remained fogged, like something had just been breathing on it. Morning arrived, and with it, Edward's desperate need to understand. He returned to Callahan's journal, flipping past the ink-blotted pages until he found something he hadn't noticed before. Folded between 2 entries was a page labeled Phase 3. It described the night the whistle stopped for Callahan, just as it had for Edward. The former tenant wrote about something entering the house, always unseen, always just out of frame. He described waking to bird bones arranged in perfect circles on the floor, feathers strung from the ceiling like warning sigils. But most horrifying was the final entry, a theory Callahan had reached too late: it doesn't kill immediately. It chooses the broken ones. The lonely. It whistles to soften their mind. It stops so they start to listen for it, to invite it in. It wasn't hunting Edward, it was grooming him. Lulling him with rhythm. Letting paranoia rot his resolve. The whistle was only the beginning. What followed was far worse. By dusk, Edward began to experience brief blackouts. Moments where time skipped ahead, where he'd find himself standing in places he didn't remember walking to. The recorder had strange gaps, sections where it had been turned off, despite his memory saying otherwise. He tried to sleep, but when he awoke just before midnight, something was wrong. His throat burned. His jaw ached. Stumbling to the bathroom, he turned on the light and faced the mirror. Stuck to his lips, was a feather. Black. Serrated. Slick with blood. He gagged, pulling it free with shaking hands. It was the same kind of feather he'd found outside, but now it was inside him. Embedded in his mouth like it had grown there. On the sink beside him, several more lay scattered, as if he'd coughed them up in his sleep. Then he saw it. Etched faintly into the condensation of the bathroom mirror, as though from a long, slow breath, were 3 words. You heard it. And in the far distance, just beneath the wind, came the faintest echo of the whistle returning. But this time, it was coming from inside the house. The following morning, Edward avoided the mirror. He couldn't bring himself to look again. Instead, he focused on the footage he'd captured during the night. He'd installed 3 motion-activated cameras outside the cottage, and 2 inside. With trembling hands, he began to review the memory cards. The files started out normal, swaying trees, the occasional owl. But at exactly 3:06 a.m., each camera glitched simultaneously. Static swallowed the screen, followed by a high-pitched whine buried beneath the digital interference. And then, they resumed, except now, they weren't empty. A figure stood near the back porch. Not walking. Not approaching. Just waiting. Too tall. Gaunt. Head cocked at an impossible angle. Its body looked human only in the vaguest sense, elongated limbs, shoulders too narrow, chest sunken like a bird's carcass. Around it, feathers floated on air that wasn't moving. The whistle, silent to Edward's ears, was visible in the vibration of the leaves around the creature's feet. The footage blinked off again. When it returned, the figure was gone. But Edward's bedroom door, previously shut, was now open. Later that day, Edward showered, trying to cleanse himself of the dread growing inside him. As the warm water ran over his back, he felt a sudden sting, like a paper cut spreading wide. Stepping out and facing the mirror again, he turned and saw them. Symbols. The same ones carved into the monolith in Whistler Hollow, now forming a jagged line down the left side of his back. Not tattooed. Not painted. Burned into the skin. He hadn't scratched himself. There was no way he could have reached that spot on his own. The lines were precise, curved, almost ritualistic. He touched one of the grooves and winced. It was warm. Alive, somehow. Edward photographed the markings. Then, beneath the skin of his ribs, he felt something twitch. He froze. Not muscle spasm, movement. Something inside. Something that didn't belong. He collapsed to the floor, shaking. That night, he didn't sleep. He feared he might wake up with feathers growing from his lungs, or worse, with the thing from the tape watching him from the end of his bed. As dusk settled, a courier arrived. An old man with watery eyes handed Edward a yellowed envelope, postmarked a week ago, but sealed with wax, bearing the same glyph he'd seen at the Hollow. No return address. Inside was a letter from someone named Alistair Callahan. The same man who had died. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. It described the final stage of the haunting. When it stops whistling, it has already begun feeding. It does not hunt your body, but your form, the idea of you. It replaces what you were with what it needs. Further down, the letter warned of shifting timelines, memory holes, echoes of yourself that move before you do. And the final sentence read: If you're reading this, Edward, then it has already seen you. And it knows you're still listening. Edward dropped the letter. Outside, the wind began to rise again. But this time, the whistle didn't come from the woods, it sang through the keyhole in his front door. Driven by a mad urge to end it all, Edward grabbed his camera and sprinted into the forest. He didn't remember deciding to do this, his body just moved. Guided by instinct, or perhaps compulsion. The trees blurred around him. The moonlight seemed to bend, forming a corridor of shadows leading him deeper. And then he saw it. Standing in the clearing where the monolith once stood, was himself. Not a reflection. Not a hallucination. It was Edward, down to the clothes he wore yesterday. He watched as the other version of him turned and whistled. Not a long, ghostly note, but something mechanical, like a call being forced through broken lungs. The doppelganger grinned, and its mouth opened wider than a human's should. Inside wasn't teeth, but feathers, slick and pulsing. The creature raised its hand and pointed. Behind Edward. He turned. Nothing. When he looked back, the clearing was empty again. No double. No monolith. No tracks. Just the sound of a slow, low whistle trailing him back to the cottage, following with every breath. Edward boarded up the doors, unplugged the internet, buried his phone. He thought if he could cut off contact, if he stopped listening, it might stop. But the truth settled in slowly, like mold in the walls. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. Not the cottage. Him. He would catch glimpses of movement just behind his eyes. He began to speak in languages he didn't recognize while half asleep. Feathers returned in the sink, in his mouth, under his pillow. His voice, when recorded, played back slightly delayed, echoing, distorted, as if another version of him spoke milliseconds behind. On the final night, he set his recorder down, and in the morning, played it back. What he heard wasn't a whistle. It was breathing. Too many lungs. Too close. The last sound on the tape, his own voice whispering words he had no memory of saying. You listened too long. And then, silence. No wind. No forest. No Edward. Only feathers, drifting gently down onto the empty bed. That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you, if you still dare to watch next time.